The spaceship Aurora 7 landed on Epsilon Prime, a world covered in endless forests, glowing rivers, and skies that never darkened completely. The human colony was small, only 100 scientists, engineers, and explorers, all eager to study this strange new world. The planet was perfect for life, yet something felt different. The air was thick with an unexplainable presence, as if the land itself was watching them. At first, it was just a feeling, a creeping unease that no one could put into words. But then, things started happening. Plants grew back overnight after being cut, footprints in the soil vanished within minutes, and animals moved in perfect harmony, like parts of a single body. The colony's lead scientist, Dr. Morgan, called it an evolutionary miracle, but Captain Elias Vaughn wasn't convinced. He had fought in wars, seen strange things on distant planets, but never had he felt something looking back at him the way this planet did. Then, the first incident happened. A group of colonists, 6 men and women, were found deep in the forest one morning, standing still, staring at the trees. Their eyes were blank, their bodies stiff, their lips moving soundlessly. When Vaughn shook them, they blinked in confusion. They didn't remember leaving the base. They didn't remember anything at all. The security footage showed them walking out of their rooms at the same time, moving in perfect synchronization, heading towards the trees. No words. No hesitation, as if something had called them. Dr. Morgan dismissed it as stress, maybe a shared hallucination. But Vaughn didn't believe in coincidences. Days passed, and more people started acting strange. Some spoke in languages they had never learned, others finished each other's sentences, and a few just stood still for hours, listening to something no one else could hear. The worst part was that they didn't think anything was wrong. They smiled, they worked, they laughed, but their eyes were different, too calm, too empty. Vaughn felt the change in the air, a silent force pressing against his thoughts. When he closed his eyes at night, he heard whispers, soft and distant, like a voice speaking from the roots of the planet itself. Dr. Morgan insisted on studying the phenomenon. He believed the planet wasn't attacking them, it was connecting with them. Vaughn didn't care. Humans weren't meant to be controlled. He ordered tighter security, keeping weapons close, watching for any signs of further influence. But the planet didn't attack with weapons. It used their own minds against them. One night, Vaughn woke up to an unnatural silence. The colony was always filled with the sounds of machines, footsteps, and quiet chatter. But now, there was nothing. When he stepped outside, he saw dozens of colonists standing in a perfect circle, staring at the sky, their mouths moving in unison. The words were not human. They spoke in a strange, rhythmic pattern, something old, something alive. He called out to them, but they didn't react. He grabbed his lieutenant, Corporal Rise, shaking him hard, but Rise only smiled, his eyes distant, and whispered, "We are not alone." We were never alone. Vaughn ordered his men to pull them back, but the colonists resisted, moving with unnatural strength. It took a full hour to drag them away, to wake them from whatever spell they had fallen into. When they finally regained consciousness, none of them remembered what happened. Dr. Morgan, fascinated, insisted on keeping them under observation, but Vaughn had seen enough. The planet wasn't just intelligent, it was changing them, reshaping their thoughts, pulling them into something larger than themselves. He decided to act. The colony had to leave. They had come to study, but now they were being studied, or worse, absorbed. He ordered an immediate evacuation, but it was already too late. Half the colonists refused to go. They didn't want to leave. They stood together, speaking with one voice, their movements slow and synchronized. The planet had taken them. The remaining free colonists ran for the ship. Vaughn led them, but every step felt heavier, every thought slower. The whispers were louder now. He could feel them pushing into his mind, trying to make him understand, to make him let go. His men stumbled, some stopping, eyes glazing over, their faces turning calm as they joined the others. Vaughn clenched his teeth, forcing himself forward, pushing his people to the ramp of the ship. He wasn't sure if they would make it. As they launched into the sky, the last thing he saw was the colonists below, standing in rows, staring up at them. They did not look angry. They did not beg for help. They only watched, their faces peaceful, their minds no longer their own. The planet had 1.AS Aurora 7 left orbit. Vaughn sat in silence, his hands shaking. He wanted to believe they had escaped. But deep in his mind, he could still hear the whispers soft, endless, waiting. They were never alone. They would never be alone again. The colony on Epsilon Prime had survived the first strange event, but something had changed. Captain Elias Vaughn could feel it in the way people spoke, the way they moved, as if they were slightly out of sync with themselves. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first. People would pause mid-sentence, as if listening to something far away. Others would react a second too late, blinking in confusion, as if their mind had wandered off. But the most unsettling part was the whispers. Vaughn first heard them at night, a soft murmur at the edge of his hearing, just below the threshold of understanding. He thought it was the wind, or maybe his own exhaustion. But then, he started hearing them during the day. And he wasn't the only one. Dr. Morgan, the head scientist, was convinced it was nothing to fear. "The planet is communicating," he said with excitement. "We should listen." Vaughn wasn't so sure. Communication was a two-way street. What if it wasn't just speaking? What if it was listening back? The colony logs showed strange gaps in people's memory. A worker forgot his own name for an hour before it suddenly came back to him. A scientist wrote an entire research report in a language no one recognized, only to insist later that she had no idea how. These weren't coincidences. Something was pushing into their thoughts, testing them, learning them, reshaping them. The first real break happened when Corporal Rise, Vaughn's second-in-command, vanished in the middle of the night. Security footage showed him walking out of his quarters, heading into the forest with a blank expression. No hesitation. No signs of struggle. He just walked. Vaughn led a search team into the trees, but there were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was as if Rise had been swallowed by the planet itself. Then, at dawn, he returned. He walked back into camp as if nothing had happened. His uniform was spotless, his expression calm. But his eyes were different. "We were wrong," he said, his voice too even, too sure. "The planet isn't just alive. It's waiting." Vaughn grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him. Waiting for what? But Reyes only smiled. "You'll understand soon." After that, the colony began to change faster. People whispered to themselves when they thought no one was watching. Some stopped responding to their own names. Others simply stood still, staring at the sky, smiling at nothing. Vaughn ordered increased security, but his men were losing focus. They hesitated before following orders, as if they were listening to something else. When Vaughn tried to reach out to command back on Earth, the long-range communication failed. No signals, no messages, just empty static. They were alone. Dr. Morgan, still fascinated, insisted they were evolving. "The planet is offering us something incredible," he argued. "A connection beyond anything humanity has ever known." Vaughn wasn't convinced. The planet wasn't offering anything. It was taking. And if they didn't act soon, there wouldn't be a colony left to save. The next night, the colony changed again. Vaughn woke up to an unnatural silence. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside. The air was still. The wind had stopped. No movement, no sound. Then he saw them. The colonists stood together in perfect rows, facing the edge of the forest. Their lips moved, but no sound came out. Vaughn stepped closer, pulse racing. He grabbed one of the colonists, shaking them hard. No reaction. He pressed his fingers to a man's neck. His heart was beating, but his mind was somewhere else. Then, suddenly, they spoke. All at once. One voice, one mind. "You do not belong." Vaughn stumbled back, gripping his weapon. "Who are you?" he demanded, though he already knew the answer. "We are here," they said together. "We have always been here. And now so are you." The whisper in his mind grew louder, pushing against his thoughts, crawling inside him like fingers searching for something to hold on to. He fought it, biting down hard on the inside of his cheek, using the pain to focus. Some of his men weren't as strong. One by one, they dropped their weapons, their faces going blank, joining the others in silent unity. Vaughn shouted, trying to snap them out of it. They were listening to something else. He ran back to the base, slamming the emergency alarm. The few remaining colonists who were still themselves woke up in a panic. Vaughn shouted orders, rallying them toward the ship. They had to leave. Now. But even as they ran, he could feel his own mind slipping, the whispers becoming his own thoughts. The closer he got to the ship, the harder it was to hold on. The colony's last survivors staggered onto the ramp, some fighting against themselves, others already lost. Vaughn barely made it inside before his vision blurred, his thoughts twisting into something that wasn't his own. The engines roared to life. As the ship lifted off, Vaughn looked back. The planet stared at him through the eyes of his former people, watching without fear, without anger. Just waiting. He knew then that he had made a terrible mistake. They had left the planet behind, but it had not left them. Captain Elias Vaughn had seen battlefields, faced the unknown on distant planets, but nothing had prepared him for this. The colony on Epsilon Prime was no longer the same. People who had once been his crew, his friends, now moved like strangers, their eyes distant, their words empty. It had started slowly, a missed conversation, a blank stare, a delayed response, but now the change was impossible to ignore. Vaughn watched as Dr. Morgan, the lead scientist, stood at the center of the colony, speaking softly to a group of colonists. He could not hear what was being said, but he recognized something chilling. They all nodded at the same time, blinked in the same rhythm, breathed as one. Vaughn clenched his fists. This was no coincidence. The planet was inside them now, creeping into their thoughts, bending them to its will. He had tried to reason with Morgan before, but the scientist was too far gone, too fascinated by the connection forming between humans and the living planet. "We are evolving," Morgan had told him the night before, his voice eerily calm. "This is the future, Captain. We don't need to fight it." But Vaughn knew better. This was not evolution. This was control. His lieutenant, Corporal Reyes, stood beside him, gripping his rifle too tightly. "We can't trust them anymore," Reyes whispered. Vaughn nodded, watching as more colonists joined Morgan's growing circle, their movements smooth and unnatural, like puppets pulled by invisible strings. Vaughn felt his own thoughts growing heavy, as if something pressed against his mind, whispering, persuading. He shook it off. Not yet. Not him. Then it happened. One of the colonists, Lieutenant Harris, walked toward them, her steps measured, her face blank. "You don't have to be afraid," she said, her voice gentle. Vaughn could see the faintest flicker of something behind her eyes, as if she were still fighting, still trying to hold on to herself. "Just listen," she continued, "and you will understand." Vaughn's heart pounded. He had known Harris for years. She had fought beside him, saved his life more than once. But this was not her anymore. He could feel it. He could see it in the way her lips moved a second before the words came, as if she were repeating something already spoken elsewhere. Reyes raised his rifle. "Step back," he warned, his voice shaking. Harris smiled, a slow, unsettling smile. "You don't need those anymore," she said. "Not where we're going." Then, before Vaughn could react, Reyes lowered his gun. Vaughn turned in shock, grabbing his lieutenant by the arm. "What are you doing?" But Reyes only stared ahead, his fingers twitching, his breathing slow. "She's right," Reyes murmured. "We don't need them. We don't need anything." Vaughn's stomach twisted. He had seen Reyes kill for survival, fight without hesitation, but now he was slipping away. Vaughn shook him hard. "Reyes, listen to me. Stay with me." For a second, just a second, his friend's expression flickered a glimpse of fear, confusion. Then it was gone. Harris turned her gaze to Vaughn. "You're the last one," she whispered. But not for long. Something in Vaughn snapped. He grabbed Reyes and ran. The remaining soldiers followed. Behind them, the colonists did not chase. They only watched, their heads tilting at the same time, their faces strangely peaceful. Vaughn didn't trust that peace. He knew what was coming. They had to escape. Now, inside the command center, Vaughn slammed the emergency lockdown. The metal doors hissed shut, sealing them in. The remaining crew, what was left of them, stood in tense silence. 5. Only 5 of them were still untouched. Vaughn felt his throat tighten. Less than a week ago, they were 100. The whispers grew louder, seeping through the walls, pressing against his skull. Vaughn gritted his teeth, pushing back. "We have to get to the ship," he said. "Now." But the others hesitated. Doubt. The planet was working on them. "It won't let us go," one soldier muttered. "It's already inside us." Vaughn refused to accept that. Not yet. Not until the very end. The plan was simple: reach the Aurora 7, break free from orbit, and hope whatever was inside them couldn't follow. But even as they ran through the corridors, Vaughn knew the odds were against them. The colonists were waiting, standing in perfect lines, blocking their path. Harris stood at the front, smiling. "You don't have to fight," she whispered. "Just listen." Vaughn lifted his gun. He didn't want to shoot, but he would if he had to. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Reyes stepped forward. Vaughn's heart pounded as his friend turned, slowly raising his own weapon at him. Vaughn took a sharp breath. "Reyes, don't do this." But Reyes only smiled. That same, empty, knowing smile. "You will understand," he said. Then, he pulled the trigger. Vaughn barely dodged in time. A split second. A fraction of a moment. The bullet struck the wall behind him. The others scrambled, chaos erupting. Vaughn didn't stop to think. Reyes was gone. His friend was gone. There was no saving him now. Shots rang out. Yells, echoes, silence. By the time Vaughn and the last 2 survivors made it to the ship, his hands were shaking. The ramp closed behind them as the engines roared to life. He didn't look back. He couldn't. As they broke through the atmosphere, Vaughn exhaled sharply, gripping the controls. They had escaped. But as the stars came into view, a whisper slithered into his mind. "You were never meant to leave." Vaughn's blood ran cold. He turned to his crew. One of them was smiling. The planet had them now. Captain Elias Vaughn could feel it in his bones, in the heavy silence of the colony, in the way his own people stared at him with empty eyes. The whispers had begun weeks ago, but now they were more than whispers. Now they were commands. Vaughn gripped his rifle as he moved through the deserted hallways of the command center, his footsteps the only sound in the eerie stillness. His crew was gone. Not dead worse. They were taken, their minds no longer their own. He had seen it happen, seen the way they had stopped resisting, the way their faces had relaxed as the planet took control. He wasn't sure how many were left. Maybe a handful of survivors hiding in the dark corners of the colony, resisting the pull for as long as they could. Maybe he was the only one left. It didn't matter. He had a mission: escape or die fighting. The ship, Aurora 7, was still intact, its engines ready to launch. If he could reach it, he could warn Earth, tell them not to come, not to send another crew, not to make the same mistake. But the planet was waiting for him. It knew his thoughts. It could feel his fear. He turned a corner and stopped. A group of colonists stood in the hallway. Their faces were calm, their bodies unnaturally still. Among them was Lieutenant Reyes, his second in command, the man who had fought by his side for years. But this wasn't Reyes anymore. The man who had once been his friend now looked at him with a gaze too empty, too knowing. "You don't have to run," Reyes said, his voice too smooth, too controlled. "It's better this way. No pain, no fear, just peace." Vaughn took a step back, gripping his rifle tighter. "You're lying," he said. "This isn't peace. This is control." Reyes tilted his head, almost as if considering the words. "Control is freedom," he whispered. "We were lost before. Now we are part of something greater. You will understand soon." Vaughn didn't wait. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the hallway, striking Rise in the shoulder. The lieutenant didn't even flinch. The others didn't react either. They just stood there, watching. Then, all at once, they moved. Vaughn barely had time to react before they lunged at him. He fired again, then turned and ran. His heart pounded, his breath came in sharp gasps. The colony wasn't a colony anymore. It was a trap, a maze designed to break him down, to push him towards surrender. But he refused. He wasn't going to let this planet take him, not like it took the others. Asa ran, a voice slithered into his mind. Not his own. Not human. Why do you fight? We only offer unity. Vaughn clenched his jaw, forcing the voice out. It wasn't real. It wasn't him. He needed to focus. The hangar was ahead, the ship waiting just beyond the blast doors. But the moment he reached for the controls, they failed to respond. Locked. The planet had already thought ahead. He turned, pressing his back against the wall, gripping his weapon. Footsteps echoed through the halls. They were coming. Too many to fight. Too many to stop. And then movement. From the shadows, a figure appeared. Dr. Morgan. The scientist had been the first to insist that the planet's intelligence was harmless, the first to argue that they should embrace its influence. But now, he looked different. His expression was too calm, his posture too relaxed. Vaughn aimed his rifle, but Morgan simply smiled. You're afraid, Morgan said softly. That's why you resist. But fear is temporary. Soon, you'll see what we see. I see enough, Vaughn growled. And I'm not letting it take me. Morgan sighed, shaking his head. It already has. The words hit Vaughn like a blow. He wanted to deny it, but deep inside, he knew the whispers were getting louder. His own thoughts were harder to hold on to. How much longer could he resist? How much longer before he became like them? Then an explosion. The blast doors shook, the walls trembled. Vaughn barely had time to register what was happening before the emergency locks disengaged. Someone had blown the security system. Someone else was still fighting. Without hesitating, Vaughn sprinted through the open doors. The Aurora 7 stood ahead, its engines humming, its entrance ramp still open. As he ran, gunfire erupted behind him. Another survivor, Sergeant Darius, one of his last remaining soldiers, covering his escape. Vaughn turned back just in time to see Darius overwhelmed, the taken colonists grabbing him, pulling him down. Vaughn met his eyes. For just a second, Darius was still himself. Then, his expression went blank. Vaughn ran faster. He barely made it inside the ship before the ramp closed behind him. The taken colonists stood outside, watching, waiting. They didn't scream. They didn't attack. They only stared. The ship lifted off. Vaughn gripped the controls, setting coordinates for deep space. As Epsilon Prime shrank below him, he let out a shaky breath. He had done it. He had escaped. Or so he thought. Then the whisper returned. You were never truly free. Vaughn's hands trembled. Slowly, he turned to look at his reflection in the glass of the control panel, and saw himself smiling. The ship floated through the dark, silent void of space, leaving the cursed planet far behind. Captain Elias Vaughn sat in the cockpit of the Aurora 7, watching the distant glow of Epsilon Prime fade into the endless blackness. His hands trembled as he adjusted the controls, trying to convince himself that they had won. He and his remaining crew, what was left of them, had escaped. They had broken free from the planet's control. But deep inside, something did not feel right. The silence in the ship was unnatural. Vaughn glanced over his shoulder at the other two survivors, Corporal Allen and Engineer Hayes. They sat strapped into their seats, staring ahead, their faces pale and unreadable. No one spoke. No one celebrated. They should have been relieved. They had survived something impossible. But the weight in the air felt wrong. Vaughn exhaled sharply and turned back to the controls. We'll reach the nearest outpost in 48 hours, he said, mostly to himself. Once we're there, we warn Earth. We tell them what happened. No one else sets foot on that planet again. Still, no one spoke. A faint uneasiness crawled through his mind. He shook it off. It was just exhaustion. The fight had been brutal. The whispers of the planet, the way it had taken over the colony, the way friends had turned into strangers, it was too much. But it was over now. It had to be. Then a sound. A faint whisper, barely there. Vaughn's blood ran cold. He turned sharply, scanning the cockpit. Nothing. Just the steady hum of the ship, the glow of the instrument panels. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Maybe it was just leftover fear. But then, Hayes let out a slow breath and finally spoke. Did we truly escape? The words sent a chill through Vaughn's spine. He turned fully to face her. What do you mean? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Hayes didn't look at him. She kept staring ahead, her hands resting on her lap, fingers twitching slightly. Something was off. We left, she murmured. We broke free. She swallowed hard. Then why do I still hear it? Vaughn's stomach twisted. No. It wasn't possible. They had left the planet's influence. The ship was clean. It had to be. Alan shifted in his seat. His face was pale, his breathing slow. I feel it too, he whispered. Like it's inside my head. Still there. Still watching. Panic threatened to rise in Vaughn's chest, but he forced it down. No. They were tired. They were scared. That's all this was. It's just your mind playing tricks on you, he said firmly. We were down there for too long. We barely made it out alive. The stress, the fear, it's messing with our heads. Hayes finally looked at him. Her eyes were too dark, too empty. Then why do you hear it too, Captain? Vaughn's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't told them about the whisper, about the voice slithering through his thoughts. But she knew. The ship suddenly felt too small. The air too thick. Vaughn clenched his fists. We're fine, he said, forcing the words out. We just need to focus. Once we reach the outpost, we'll get checked. Make sure we're a flicker. The lights in the cockpit dimmed for a fraction of a second. The screens glitched. A low, static-like hum filled the ship. Vaughn's pulse spiked. What was that? Hayes stared at the controls. Something's wrong, she whispered. The ship shut down. For a moment, there was complete darkness. Then, emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in a dim red glow. Vaughn grabbed the controls, trying to restart the systems. Nothing responded. Alan let out a shaky breath. We're not alone, he whispered. Vaughn turned sharply, his heart pounding. What are you talking about? Alan's face was too still. His expression was blank, like he was listening to something only he could hear. Then he smiled. Vaughn's grip tightened on the armrest. Alan. We never escaped, he said softly. We just brought it with us. The words hit like a hammer. Vaughn's breath turned shallow as a horrible realization crept into his mind. The planet never needed to keep them there. It had let them go. It had wanted them to leave. Because now it was inside them. Hayes suddenly gasped, clutching her head. No, 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 she whispered, shaking violently. I don't want to then, she stopped. Slowly, her hands fell to her sides. She straightened, her breathing steady. When she looked up, her face was calm. Too calm. She smiled. Vaughn stood up so fast his chair nearly fell over. No. This wasn't happening. Not here. Not on his ship. Stay back, he warned, his hand moving toward his sidearm. Hayes just tilted her head, that eerie, unnatural smile still on her lips. You'll understand soon, she whispered. A sharp pain stabbed into Vaughn's skull. He staggered, gripping the edge of the control panel. The whisper wasn't faint anymore. It was deafening. Words he didn't understand, thoughts that weren't his own. It was inside him, inside all of them. Alan stood up next to Hayes, his expression empty, his movements too smooth, too controlled. You don't have to fight, he said. It's already over. Vaughn's vision blurred. His breath came in ragged gasps. He tried to move, tried to resist, but his body felt heavy. The ship around him dimmed, distorted, changed. Or maybe he was the one changing. The last thing he saw was his own reflection in the cockpit glass, and for the first time he wasn't sure if the face staring back was really his own.